Hi, this is Vicki of Green Eyed Lady Designs with another Photoshop Elements tutorial. Selena has done a video showing you how to create a custom drop shadow in Photoshop so that you can make it appear as if the corners of these cute little tags here are just lifting slightly off the page. In Photoshop, you do that by creating a drop shadow with a layer style, and then you put those layer styles on their own layer, and then Selena used the warp tool to further manipulate the shadows. We can't do that in Photoshop Elements, so Selena has challenged me to see if I can come up with a way to do something similar in Elements. And you know me, always up for a challenge, so here's what I've come up with. I've moved Selena's background paper and her tags over to a new document. By the way, that layout that Selena did was using the Moving Forward kit from the Follow Your Art series. I've moved her tags and her background paper over here on this side, and then I've created a copy of her tags and then created my own shadow, and this is what I've come up with. As you can see, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty darn close, and I wanted to show you how to do that. Let me just hide my shadow layer so that we can follow along. First thing we're going to need to do is make a copy of this tag layer, so I'm going to do Control or Command J to duplicate the layer, and then I'm going to rename this shadow so I don't get confused with what I'm doing here. Now we're going to need to fill this layer with black. Let's hide the tag layer so you can see what I'm doing here. Control or Command click, and we're going to go to Edit, Fill Selection, and we're going to fill with a color. Now remember, in Selena's video she explained that shadows aren't truly black, they're really picking up colors from what they're reflecting. So we're going to do what she did, and we're going to choose a color that's more like a warm brown, and the color that I've chosen I think is pretty similar to the color she actually used. So if you're trying to duplicate this at home, you can do 2C1901 is the hex code for that number. I'm going to say OK. Now we're going to leave the blending mode as normal, the opacity at 100%, and the preserve transparency is unchecked, and say OK. Control or Command D to deselect. And if we hide Selena's tags here, you can see that we've got the outline of our basic shape of our shadow is started. Now we need to blur it a bit. Selena used an outer glow to do that, and while we do have an outer glow layer effect in Photoshop Elements, we don't really have the same kind of control that you have in Photoshop, so we're going to have to fake it. And to do that, we're going to do a Gaussian blur. So we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and because the tags that we're shadowing are actually paper and they would normally sit very close to the paper, we want our shadow to be a little bit darker. So we're going to just use a radius of 3 and click OK. Now you can see we sort of have this warm fuzzy effect, and if you recall in Selena's video she changed the blending mode to linear burn because that gives a sort of truer reflection from the paper below. So let's do that, linear burn. And then we want to lower the opacity so it's very similar to Selena's shadow. There we go. 30%. This is like 37, 35%. I think that's close enough. So let's put Selena's tags visible again, and let's make these tags visible again. And now we need to actually manipulate the shadow. In Selena's video she used the warp tool to do that. We don't have a warp tool in Elements, so we're going to use the smudge tool to accomplish the same thing. The smudge tool is over here in your toolbar. It's nested with the blur tool and the sharpen tool, so if you may see a little blur drop or the sharpen triangle, or you may see the smudge tool, and that's what we want, smudge. And in the blending options, you'll notice that I've got a 500 pixel brush. Now, when you select the smudge tool, it will default to the right type of brush, but the size is probably going to be a lot smaller. And for this work, we're going to be doing very detailed work. You want to make that large. So 300 to 500 pixels should work, and the mode should be normal, and the strength is 50%. Now before I go on, I want to show you one thing. As I hover over here, over these tags, you'll see that I have crosshairs in the middle of this brush. For this kind of detailed work, I really prefer to have my crosshairs visible. It makes using the smudge tool a lot easier. So you can change that setting if you'd like. Always change it back, but if you'd like to do this along with me, you can change the settings by going to the Photoshop preferences. Now, on a Windows machine, you'll find the preferences under the Edit menu. On a Mac, it's under the Photoshop Elements menu. And we'll go to Preferences, and what we're looking for is Display and Cursors. And I've got mine set over here on the left of the painting cursor, the full-size brush tip, and to show the crosshairs in the tip. Say OK. Now I'm still working on the shadow layer here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start to drag down this shadow just ever so slightly so that it peeks out from underneath the tag. The key to working with the smudge tool is very tiny, small movements. So the first thing I'm going to do, let's start with the bottom one here. The first thing I'm going to do is go drag, click and drag, put my crosshairs right on the bottom corner there, and click and drag ever so slightly down, just a little tiny bit. Now if you go too far, you can always do an undo, but I always find it a little safer to start with smaller movements and try to add. And just everywhere I want that to peek out, I'm just going to drag ever so slightly down. That's looking good. And then we need a little bit here up in the upper right hand corner, just a little touch. How are we looking? So you can see over here we have the shadow peeking out all the way down here, and maybe we could do just a little bit more here. Like I said, teeny tiny little movements. Now the next thing that Selena did was a tip that I'd never heard of before that was really very cool. She used the blur tool to further blur the edges of the shadow. And remember, I told you the blur tool is nested here with the smudge tool. I'm going to use blur, and I want this to be a little bit smaller. I want my movements to be a little more precise. So this is 90 pixels. You can adjust that if you want to. And the strength, let's move the strength back up to, 50%. Let's move it back up to about 50% is where we want it. Now, by the way, if your settings are all different from these, it's very easy to go back to the basic settings, default settings in Photoshop. Just click this down arrow here next to the sample of the brush and say the reset tool. So it's put me back to a size 13 brush, mode of normal, these darn tooltips, and a strength of 50. And I think that'll actually work for us here. So I'm just going to very lightly stroke over the shadow that's peeking. And you may not be able to see that perfectly, but it is softening up the edge of these shadows a little bit. Okay, what do you think? Pretty good? Okay, let's do it again on this center tag here. Gonna go back to the, hello mouse, smudge tool. And then, as I said, very, 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 very softly here, pull down from the corner, pull down, click and drag to pull down, click and drag to pull down, and then a little tiny bit up over here on the top. Switch back to our blur tool. See how that's working, and it's softening up those edges nicely. And now we're ready to do the top tag. Back to the smudge tool. And on this one you can see that Selena's got a bigger shadow. A little more shadow here, a little more shadow here, and a little bit more here. So once again, I'm going to click and drag at the corner of the tag here. Drag down. This one I'm going to do just a little bit more. And a little bit more over here. Maybe a little bit more over here. And then in the upper corner, as I said, the key to this smudge tool is teeny tiny movements to start with. Okay, that's looking good. Now if you notice here, I've pulled this whole shadow out over here, and in Selena's version it's not pulled out here, so this is very close to the paper here, and this is a little tiny bit further away. So to take care of that, I'm just going to click and drag here on this area of the shadow and drag it back in, and then drag it just a tiny bit out from the top up here. Now we'll go back to our blur tool and blur the edges here. And I'm thinking maybe as I'm looking at this, maybe we want to reduce the opacity of this shadow layer just a little bit more. There we go. So I've showed you how you can create custom drop shadows in Photoshop Elements using the blur tool and the filter blur, and using this smudge tool. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'm looking forward to see how you can create your own custom drop shadows.